Don't tell any of those terrorists out there. Okay, here we go. Professor Tootle,
Yes.
I very much wanted to do this discussion on abortion, the history of abortion in the United States, particularly in relationship to federalism, because I think it has to be 0.1% of the population that even has any idea what I just talked about. Abortion in relationship to federalism.
Yeah, tell me
My instinct
what I
says
missed.
that probably no
A
one
lot of guys.
has read Roe v. Wade. Um, Maybe a couple law students or something, but very few citizens have probably read it. And and understanding federalism, I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert in federalism. My guess is you're not either, but maybe. So let's start the show with a little bit of your background, because I don't think you're an expert on abortion. So we should at least give some context why we're even having this discussion. And I'll tell you my rationale again here in just a minute. But introduce yourself and any relevant experience to abortion policy or federalism. Professor Tootle.
Yeah, I'm an American history professor. So, my PhD is in American history. I've been teaching American history now for, I don't know, 20 something years. I don't really remember, since 1998, however long that is. I've written and thought a lot about many issues surrounding American history and the role of the government and especially this kind of interplay between what is government policy and what is social policy, what is, or to put it another way, positive and negative liberty. So the right to do something or the right to be left alone. It has always been one of those subjects that has fascinated me.
Gotcha. And abortion is probably as good of a case study on that topic as any, correct?
Yes, but the thing about a lot of these fields is that people tend to focus on one thing or the other, and so I have a somewhat unique perspective precisely because I'm not a specialist in these two areas, because I study this sort of the context that brings them both about. Because as I think you'll see from my initial comments about the Texas case, there is a broader historical context that these legal arguments fall into.
Okay, let's not go to Texas quite yet.
Yeah.
So here's my.
We lost your sound.
Your sound is shot, John. No, John's freezing.
I think we lost John.
I'm a subject matter expert. But I'm saying that I've been door to door with Republican elected officials since 1988 talking abortion. And when you manage a Republican in Denver, state legislative candidate, almost 1 out of 2.
Lost his audio again. I wonder if it's something he's doing or if it's just his internet connection.
When did I lose you?
Well, you cut in and out. So if you ask a question at the end of it.
Haven't asked a question yet.
Okay.
The premise is this. Politicians and people that manage politicians talk about this. You have to, especially in Republican, but I bet in Democratic circles as well. Doctors talk about this. Women talk about this. Theologians talk about this. There's a wide variety of lawyers study this in law school. You're none of that.
Right.
Well, you may be a theologian, but you're none of that. I was interested, since I've spent my life as the political side of this issue, be interested in how a historian approaches the importance of abortion policy and politics in America, because my guess is you might approach it differently than many of those other fields and interests. Do you agree or disagree with this? Yeah, you were a little reticent to talk about this. I was very excited. You were a little reticent. So talk to me about your perspective on this.
Well, I just know that it's such a hot button issue that it's one of those things that no matter what I say, it's going to make people upset. Because I feel like when I describe what I consider to be, I'm trying to be somewhat even-handed in my description of events, but of course I have personal feelings about the issue as well. But as I'm trying to describe reality, the people are so emotionally invested in this topic that that if you don't use, it's one of those items where if you don't use the right labels or terms, people just shut down and say, I'm no longer listening to you anymore. You're one of them. And we know that that's just how a lot of people approach hot button issues.
So that's the second reason I wanted to chat with you about this today, is because on a lot of topics, you and I agree on, or at least generally agree on the main theme. There's a very good chance that you and I not completely disagree, but mostly disagree about this topic. And I wanted to at least hope, we'll see if it can happen, that people could have a thoughtful debate or dialogue on this subject, including being emotional, without just throwing hatred and spewing venom out into the world. And so we'll see how that happens. Okay, abortion politics and federalism in the United States. Do we need to go back to the first abortions in 1550 BC? Do we need to know anything about Soviet Union? That's one of your areas of emphasis. They first legalized abortion in 1920. Do we need to know about England and the Abortion Law Reform Society in 1936? Do we need to know that UK legalized abortion in the Abortion Act of 1967? Do we need to know any of that, or do we have to jump right to the first U.S. Supreme Court of Roe v. Wade? What's your historical
I think I think we need to know sort of a deeper background with regards to how some things function in the court system. Maybe the first part of this is to realize that our Constitution is a freedom document, and that that the legal theory the United States was founded upon is that the federal government is there in order to secure rights. And generally speaking, your negative liberties were originally intended to be protected by the federal government, and positive liberties are supposed to be enacted by your state and local government. And negative liberties would be you have the right to be left alone. Positive liberties would be you have the right to, in concert with your fellow citizens, decide to do something together. And so think of it in those terms. The next thing that is relevant for the...
Now, Professor, let me interrupt. I have heard you talk about positive and negative liberties 5 times, maybe 10 times over the last years that we've known each other, both in writing and together. I have a political science degree and a law degree, and I've practiced in this field. I'm still not quite sure I get positive and negative liberties. And do you think I'm alone, or do you think that's common? Is it just not soaking into me?
Well, I mean, I would just say, think of it in terms of your right to be left alone. Those are your negative liberties. Your right to do things. Those are your positive liberties.
No one else talks like this. I haven't seen articles in the Denver Post or the Washington Times or Post or the New York or Wall Street Journal. No one uses these words on a regular basis, do they, besides you?
Yeah, and I think it might be as a result of, like you said, my somewhat unique mixture of studying, because it drove me, especially in the study of totalitarianism, back to these philosophical arguments about communism versus classical liberalism. And so I still think in those terms, and I think that that's the most appropriate way to describe the first political fights between Hamilton and Jefferson. And so in many ways, the stuff that we're still fighting about is an outgrowth of the disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson about what is the proper role of positive, what is the proper role of positive government? What is Jefferson's idea was that the difference between liberals and conservatives are government. Is it more important that government secures rights, or is it more important that government shapes society in concert with the will of the majority today? So I don't know. I can't explain why nobody else uses these terms, but I find them useful when we have discussions like this.
And thanks for letting me pause you again. You were on a theme, though, so go back to that theme if you remember where you were.
Oh, so the initial right after the ratification of the Constitution, these kinds of arguments were the first ones to come up, because there were court cases where people were suing their states. And so in response to that, the United States added another amendment to the Constitution, the 11th Amendment, that says you can't sue states. And then, of course, our other discussions about slavery and racism play into the next sort of big era, which is that.
So let me ask you from a layman's perspective, and then you can teach for a second. When you suggested that I read Freedom National by James Oakes, to me it seemed like an exact parallel of the abortion debate regarding federalism. Is slavery a national issue or is it a state issue? And what is that appropriate way to deal with that issue? And if we determine that it's national, is it a federal law or do you need a constitutional amendment? And then, of course, the Supreme Court comes along in Roe v. Wade in '73. But is that an okay parallel?
Yeah, in fact, I hadn't thought of it this way, but it's actually a great parallel insofar as what we have in our system is this tension between securing rights and securing rights and then the will of the majority. And when you have something that people experience and believe as an injustice, if you have a particular feeling about that the X or Y is wrong and we need to fix this problem, you're going to take these impulses and you're going to drop them into the American political system. And what our system is designed to do is to make it so that you and everybody else in America peacefully argues about this. And it's going to work its way in a very messy long-term discussion. It's going to work its way through courts and state legislatures and local courts and district courts and federal courts and state legislatures and city councils and school boards. And it's going to go through all of these processes, all designed with the same thing in mind, which is to slow you down, to try to get you to get past your desires towards using logic and reason and facts. And the best way that, and this, modern social science proves that the founding fathers were right about this. The only way to achieve the best result is when you have authentic disagreement that takes place peacefully.
So, Professor,
yeah, go ahead.
As a side question, point, I think that's the only reason I still describe myself as a conservative, is that process of slowing it down and peaceful disagreement through legislatures or executive bodies and courts, et cetera, et cetera. It's frustrating because sometimes I want an immediate decision, but really I'd rather make sure that people don't go to war over those decisions. Let's let the process play out.
Yeah,
is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And think about the implications of what you've just done. So I know you said we aren't going to talk about the Texas case, but it's actually a perfect example of this, because I know that there are a lot of conservatives out there who, if you were to take the legal theory of that Texas case and apply it to the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, they would have a real problem with that. So I would just say, be careful what you advocate for structurally based on what you want at the moment, because it's going to have long-term implications for your rights in other areas. So getting back to sort of 19th century racism and slavery, the next problem that maybe our founders hadn't anticipated was brought about because slavery didn't go away in the South. And they never really anticipated that there would be a group of people who would be permanently, at the time, seemingly permanently, systematically denied their rights by their legislative assembly. So then you have this problem that is supposed to be fixed by, and I would say, a plain reading of the Declaration and the Constitution should have meant that we didn't need a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments come into play precisely to settle this question of how the Constitution is supposed to be interpreted, so that, it sort of lays it out, that you take the Declaration and you put it into the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, and you give the federal government the right to enforce civil rights laws in the states. So because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the South, there was this problem of states not protecting the rights of their own citizens. So it creates this legal problem that the court has to somehow solve. Of you can't sue states under the 11th Amendment, but who do you sue, or who do you stop from when a state is engaged in some sort of activity that violates the civil rights of their citizens? And they come up with this solution to the problem, which says, well, you can't sue the states, but you can sue the state actor who is implementing this law. So you can sue the sheriff, so in other words, you sue the person, not the state. You sue the person who is acting on behalf of the state. So anyway, it gets into these questions of qualified immunity and what's called sovereign immunity, of under what circumstances and who can sue who. So the question of the next sort of thing that's relevant in history to really discuss is there were a lot of people who were pushing for, in the 19th century, that was the sort of era of scientific racism, and people pushing the idea of eugenics, and that would include things like birth control, but which we still sort of think of as a good thing, but it also includes things like sterilization and abortion as solutions to how to make society better. So you get into these questions of positive and negative liberty in the late 19th, early 20th century, with people who are pushing for eugenics because they say, in order to make society better, we should sterilize certain people. We should have abortions for certain people, and then, of course, making birth control more accessible. And this becomes highly politicized now, because many of the same people who were held up as kind of heroes for because they were advocates for birth control. But one of the things that's kind of problematic for people, if you want to just hold some of these people up and say, hey, this person's a hero, is a lot of these other people, these same people who are advocating for birth control, were also arguing for sterilization, eugenics, and scientific racism. So it leads to this modern tendency to overlook the full arguments that people were making even at those times. Then there's also a religious aspect to it as well, where we were predominantly a Protestant country, and Protestants were allowed to use birth control and Catholics weren't. So that was also informing how the politics played out. But through most of American history, the basic legal standard was, this is not a national issue. This is something that is decided at the state and local level. And then when the Roe decision came around, it was really a result of a lot of changes that took place in American society after World War II that nationalized a lot of politics. And again, some of that was driven just by the need to have a more modern state, and some of it was driven by civil rights issues that tended to force the need for national action within the state and clarify what was constitutional. The Roe decision,
Professor, let me interrupt you before we go to Roe. And team, you're going to be able to ask questions in about 7 or 8 minutes. Let me ask you from a different perspective, from a little bit of my legal training. I've read all these cases.
I lost your volume again. Sorry, John, we can't hear you. And your video just froze for me too. You want to type it in the chat? We lost your volume.
Can you hear me again, Professor?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm going to have to talk to my cable provider or internet provider. The 14th Amendment, it surprised me going all the way back to Roe when I was a little kid, but it definitely surprised me during college and law school when we studied it, that a very simple thing, nor shall, the first phrase, first part of the 14th Amendment, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property without due process of law, expanding the Fifth Amendment to the states. That in 1925, get-go regarding the First Amendment, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1965, Griswold, the contraception, 1967, interracial marriage and Loving, and then finally 1973, and then afterwards, Bush v. Gore on gun rights in 2010, Oberfield on same-sex marriage. There has been a steady progression of expanding the 14th Amendment over time, but I don't know if anyone actually anticipated a fundamental right to privacy made up by the Supreme Court. Was it a surprise to everyone, or give some kind of historical perspective to that before you go into Roe?
Well, I would just say that what we often forget is that we live in a pluralistic system. There is no single right that is supreme over all other rights. So we have many rights, and the purpose of politics is to negotiate between these rights. So when people say, I think, I've been guilty of this sometimes too, where you say that like the invented right to privacy. That's actually not totally true. The right to be left alone was considered so fundamental to our natural rights that I think that the opponents of abortion go too far sometimes in their criticism of the Roe decision. Again, I think there's a lot of things you can criticize about the Roe decision, but the part where they say that you have this fundamental right to be left alone and you have a right to privacy, I don't think that's outside the American legal tradition. I don't think that that's an invented right. I think that's a clear and common sense reading of how the principles of the Declaration should have always been interpreted in the Constitution. And I think that is explicitly correct in the Constitution after the passage of the 14th Amendment. So I think that the right to privacy, which is, really what we're talking about here, the right to be left alone, it is a fundamental right. But like all rights, it is not supreme. It doesn't live out on an island. It is something to be negotiated in concert with our other rights.
So, Professor, I screwed up your train of thought again, so I might as well just do one or two more, and then open it up. I have always been an advocate of the essential components of Roe. So I'm pro-choice, if that's in common vernacular. I just irritated 45% of the country. Shocking. I've been irritating 45% of the country on that and other issues my whole career. But I would want the federal government. State government is my first preference, but then second preference is to legislate it, and real preference, because I'm so pro-choice, that I'd like it to be in the Constitution. I'd like it to be legislative made rather than court made. Even if you think it's the willingness to be, or the right to be left alone as part of the United States structure, sometimes in slavery, you talk about maybe you didn't need to do it, it would have happened anyway. What's your thought on that? Conservatives, a court shouldn't be making law.
I guess my first thought is that I'm constantly reminded that you can take almost every public survey poll and just chuck it out the window when it comes to abortion, because almost everyone begins by describing themselves as either pro-life or pro-choice. Mm-hmm. And then, but if you look at the better studies, the ones that remove the labels and ask only about what would you have done? What is your specific idea? What you find is, and this is a crazy thing to even contemplate, is that about 85 to 90% of Americans have exactly the same position on abortion. And you wouldn't suspect that based on what most polling data would indicate. But that's what comes out when you begin asking people, okay, well, you say that you are against abortion. Does that mean that you want to put a woman in jail for seeking one? And then people will just recoil and say, oh, no, of course not. But then when you start, so the questions I think are far more appropriate is, what is it specifically that you want? I mean, I think you can have more fruitful discussions with people if you begin by asking, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And then what would be the best way of accomplishing that goal? And what you will find is there are very few people who actually think that what I want is, I want to confiscate I want to tax all Americans at a 70% rate so that, an abortion provider can come to my house and abort my baby 1 week before it's to be delivered. And what you find is no one holds that position, and so everybody has within them exceptions to these two purported labels that they give to one another. And what you find is, once you begin drilling down, that most people agree on most of the fundamentals.
Well, so here's my follow-up question. I generally agree with that. After thousands of conversations in my life over this subject, I generally agree to that. Even people that pretend's not the right word, portray themselves as extremist on one side or the other. When you sit down privately and chat with them, they go, yeah, I know, I just don't like abortion though. Or the right to privacy is so fundamental, stay out of my body. And it's between me and my doctor, period. Yeah. They start with a position, but then you can actually have a conversation as long as they trust you.
And say 10% or 10 to 15% of people are extremists, that still means that 10%, 15% is a lot, so just sorry to interrupt,
fair enough.
This is let's not forget, 15% of America is, what would that be? 40 million Americans, something like that.
And some of the most active politically.
Right. And by the way, they are the most active.
And so, but Professor, when the court ruled, even though I happen to agree basically with the decision, I firmly believe, off my own evidence of decades of chatting with people at their homes, that this is fundamentally split the country apart. That people do hate each other over this topic. Doors do get closed. You say, I'm running for office, and that I've seen it hundreds of times. Are you pro-choice or pro-life? And the elected official goes, well, I'd like to, if they are trying to be sophisticated. But if they don't say pro-choice or pro-life and they answer wrong, the door gets shut, including curse words and go to hell, I'm never voting for you, or you're a murderer, or you blah, 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 blah. I think it's really been a disservice to our country not to have this kind of discussion in legislative bodies, rather than deferring to previously 9 men and now men and women in a judicial body. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yes, and I think one of the other things that has really, we've talked about this as an issue too. I think one of the things that has really driven the polarization of this is the weakening of the political parties, because now you can't say, let's say if you were a good politician who is going to say and do the right thing for all the right reasons, and you say, well, if you're forcing me to say I'm pro-life or pro-choice, I'm pro-life. But then when you get into office, you are going to face not opposition from the other political party, you're going to face opposition from within your own political party, because there's going to be some sort of an interest group that's going to begin ranking you and deciding that just because one person votes one way on one piece of legislation, that you have an A- on this scorecard and this person has an A. And so if you really believe in pro-life, this is the most pro-life person. And what that does is it pushes our politics to the extremes in order to make sure that you please the interest group rather than advancing the cause. I can think of specific examples where if you are, I would say, pro-life, then what your goal should be is reducing the number of abortions. I mean, to me, that seems like the most obvious pro-life position to take. Let's have fewer of these. But there are sometimes when pro-life organizations will give you a lower grade based on, making the morning after pill more accessible. And I would say, well, that's contrary to your stated goal of wanting to reduce the number of abortions needed. So, and so it pushes people to the extremes to take positions that they really shouldn't want to take.
Cool. We're going to open it up after this last question. So get ready with your questions, team. Professor, Texas, I think was a big surprise. That I didn't know of that. I didn't conceive of that type of citizen involvement in enforcing the role of the state. Peer pressure, not violence, I don't think, but this is a really outside the box thing from my perspective. So I'm surprised it passed, actually. And the U.S. Supreme Court kind of has let it go for now. I don't know if they'll eventually do that. But what do you have a perspective on I said I wanted to talk about Texas. I just wanted to hold it till now.
So, I mean, you should have been able to see the Texas thing coming because it passed as it was a state law. And it was based on this law school law journal article that said this is a theoretical thing you can do. It wasn't designed to actually work. It was a theoretical exercise in enforcement, because the way that most abortion laws get struck down is with a preliminary injunction of some kind, or a court order that says we're going to stay this until it works its way through the court system. And people will court shop and find all you need to do is find one judge. And so understanding this guy who is a judge wrote this article a few years ago saying, well, the reason that can happen is because of this quirk in the law that I described dealing with the 11th Amendment, because the 11th Amendment and the enforcement mechanism that had to be invented in 1908 says that you have to sue the state actor, the person. You can't sue the state. And so in essence, this is something that is designed to keep it from going into effect designed to allow the law to go into effect for now. Mm-hmm. And what the Supreme Court decided was not the issue of abortion and nothing on the merits of the case of abortion. What they really were presented with was this situation where, okay, you have this case that is coming to you saying, put a stop to this. But one of the things that the Supreme Court must consider is who is the aggrieved party. And in this particular instance, there is no aggrieved party because no one has done it yet. And so in the petition that was put before the Supreme Court, there was no victim and there was no perpetrator. There was no plaintiff and there was no defendant. And so all they really decided is, in their decision, is that, well, they said, like, this hasn't happened yet. Nothing has happened yet. So what they'll probably do is manufacture a case so that somebody tries to do it, and then you could sue to have it stopped, and it would be stopped. But all the Supreme Court decided for right now is that they aren't going to do anything yet. And part of it was that, when the pro-abortion side made their petition, they just named this person and said, we're saying that this is the person who is going to sue an abortion provider. And that person said, I have no intention of suing an abortion provider. And so the Supreme Court said, well, we can't stop somebody from doing something when they're swearing that they're not going to do it, and nobody's done it yet. So what the Supreme Court decided was really has more to do with that particular question. Now, I'll make what I think is the best part of the Roberts and Kagan dissent, which is by allowing this by not stopping it now, this is going to open up a sort of Pandora's box, because what we're going to now see is every state legislature doing this in order to achieve some result. Whether it's limiting the First Amendment rights of Facebook or limiting Second Amendment rights of gun owners. And essentially, I guess I understand the Kagan Roberts position in that regard, and Breyer also, when they're making that argument. But the other five have this on their side, which is, this is an emergency petition. They answered it in 29 days. This isn't how the Supreme Court is supposed to make momentous decisions. This is a decision that will have broad ramifications far outside of abortion cases. So we're not going to take this up in 29 days.
Yeah, agreed. And furthermore, I although it's uncomfortable and often ugly, I like citizens having these topics of debate on freedom and what it means and conflicting values. And although it's awkward, who else do we want to do it? Who do we want to make decisions for us? I'd rather us, through our legislative bodies, make decisions rather than courts. Okay, team. Now's your time to ask Professor Tootle anything you'd like on the subject of federalism or abortion. And by the way, we have to end in 22 minutes, period. If we end earlier than that, that's fine too, if you don't have many questions. But ask away. Who feels strongly about this from what you've heard from Professor Tootle so far? Ben, you took your mic off.
Yeah, I kind of been ignoring the news lately, so I'm kind of a fringe person here on what's going on in Texas. So my question is in relationship to the government versus Texas. Is the government suing Texas over the due process law of the clause of the 14th Amendment? Because everything I've read in the press says they're going to court and not saying a whole lot. So
and you're talking about Merrick Garland's recent statements, is that correct?
I don't know. I've just heard this in the press. The government is trying to sue. So help me understand why.
There is a federal statute that says that the federal government has the right to insert themselves in civil rights cases basically anywhere in the United States that they feel like it. It's a very broadly drawn federal statute. And that is the statute. I mean, everybody knows it's there, right? I promise you that the person who wrote the original Law Journal article, I mean, I always think it's funny. I haven't read the whole thing, but I really should, because I heard some commentary on this where they're like, they should have read the whole thing because they just read the part about how to write this innovative Texas law. But of course, in the Law Journal article, there's more about, why this will fail and how this will go down and stuff. But yes, absolutely. This is one of the most established and most used statutes in federal law by the Attorney General's office. So they are all well aware of this statute to enforce civil rights everywhere in the United States.
And you're predicting will likely win.
I would say it's a near lock. It is as close to certain as anything you can possibly imagine. Yeah.
Gotcha. Ben, did that satisfy you for now?
Yeah, it did. It's just a press isn't going into any detail. They're just making it sound like the government's going to come in and squash this. But I kind of wanted the detail on what was going on with it. So thank you.
Cool. Who's up next? Kate, I can't believe you're not mad at us yet. I used pro-choice, which pleased some people. Professor used pro-abortion, which really irritated me and others. Anyway, but Kate, not to put you on the spot, but you have an opinion on this.
Oh, I certainly have an opinion.
Jump in.
I'm actually surprised not to hear more from the libertarian side of John Brackney, who would be the one to say, it is nobody's business what you do medically. Why has the state of Texas decided to insert vigilantes in the process? That's kind of my main concern is Texas is happy to arm itself against anything. Don't we see some kind of dangerous implications when it comes to arming Texans against each other over something that is medical at its foundation?
So Kate, this irritates all my friends that are on my side of this issue. And then Professor, I'd like you to take it slightly broader. I feel adamantly about government staying away from my life, my pocketbook and my body and my bedroom, and just stay the heck as far away now, not national security and local cop too, local law enforcement, but as limited government involved in my life as possible, I support, including the right of other states to do something different that I disagree. So that's part of my philosophy. If Texas wants to do something crazy, I'm not as concerned about it if it was going on in Colorado. I like that Nevada does some weird things regarding sex workers. That I think that's fine. Do I want that in Colorado? Nope. Is it fine that they do it? Sure. I like that Utah takes a more pious view on other things. Is it my preference? No. So, Professor, it goes back to, again, slavery and whether it's a state ability to regulate. And Kate, I feel so strongly about this that I am actually in favor of a national or even constitutional amendment advocating the right of privacy rather than a court made. But that's just me. Professor, can you kind of take some of what Kate's asking me and put it in more historical terms?
Well, I just don't know that you need a separate, to me, the 14th Amendment is clear enough on a right to privacy that it is, to me, it makes the Constitution a little more legislative rather than based on principle, we
had drinking and then no drinking, two of them. I mean, come on.
But I sort of disagree with that. I mean, that's the point. Like alcohol specifically, it's bizarre, really, to me to get the Constitution involved in what should be properly, to me, the role of Congress. But the other thing that is, I guess the tension I've always felt with the libertarian case for abortion or choice or life rights is that often advocates on both sides want to claim the positive and the negative liberty simultaneously. So you'll have people who say, well, I believe that we have the right to privacy, and the right to privacy would mean the right to be left alone. So, but then they claim, not only do I have the right to privacy, I have the right to have you pay for what I'm doing. And that's, those things I would say are in conflict with one another. You have either the right to be left alone, or if I'm going to pay for this, then I have a say. To me, that seems like the more consistent position. If you want the federal government to pay for this, then the federal government gets to regulate it. Or if the federal government is not going to pay for it, then fine. To me, I kind of prefer, I find it to be a more intellectually honest argument. If you're making the right to privacy argument, that you should make the right to privacy argument and say, we don't want the federal government to have any role in this, except for to pay for it. That always struck me as a strange, positions to have at the same time. Like,
something.
Yeah.
Well, wait, Kate, why don't you finish, and then whoever else.
Well, it's directly an answer to what he's just saying, because I would say the pushback to that would be single people having to pay for kid stuff, pregnancies. That's healthcare, according, if anybody's had kids, right, Mr. Tootle, the government, will pay for that. So not that I believe it, but just intellectually, your argument, that would apply there too, that the single people should get together and oppose spending on kids, because that's your decision. And, not that I'm saying let's pay for abortions, because that is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying intellectually, you got to throw that out there if you're going to make that argument.
And Kate, you were going to say something similar, I bet. So go ahead and say it, and then he'll respond to both of you.
Yes, it was going to be a similar flavor to people who don't have kids, but we have public education. because we agree it's for the greater good. So I don't necessarily like aligning healthcare with education that way, but really what I'm interested in is following the logical conclusion that you brought up, John, about if the government is only going to be involved in basic safety measures like policing and everything else, just leave me the hell alone. I tend to follow Bill Clinton's theory that if you keep abortion funded, you're keeping it safe. Let's make it rare. Let's make it safe. So just from a healthcare standpoint, if the government's going to be involved in certain healthcare things like, oh, I don't know, vaccine mandates, let's keep it safe, because making it illegal does not make it go away.
I'll add one more, Professor. Viagra, I think it's a matter of privacy. No one should have to know what that, but on the other hand, I'm comfortable with government paying for the pill, whatever that thing is, the Viagra pill.
And I also would like to step in as somebody who ran a women's clinic where abortions were not, we didn't do them. We put people on birth control and things like that. This is a socioeconomic issue. You know, this is the people that I saw at our clinic who are looking for or in need of services that might require birth control and or ultimately abortions were people that were low income. And so
Cool.
it's disproportionate. It's disproportionately an issue for a group of people that do you know what I mean? And I think that needs to be taken into control as we're looking at it.
So you've got
let me see if I can remember all these. All right, let's take them in reverse. Anthony's point, my first point would be, Anthony, I agree with you, and that's precisely why these things should not be universal. And this also addresses something that John just brought up, meaning I support Viagra for poor people, but I don't support the government paying for it for rich people. So I would say, I don't think that it is universal when, my theory of government is that the proper role of government is to do for a community of citizens what they cannot do for themselves.
Right.
And so in that case, I would say, yes, absolutely. Let's pay for the healthcare of poor people, not of rich people. And then that sort of also answers John's point. And to combine Jason and Kate's point, you're missing my analogy. You're both, because the example that you gave was about the funding of education. What I'm saying is, taking your example of education, what you would be saying is, you must pay for my education, and we're going to have no say in how that education is delivered. That's not how education happens. We have a lot of rules about how education happens. It's regulated. My point was that you can't insist on both. You can't insist on money and no regulation. It has to be, if you're going to take the money, you are going to be regulated.
So Parenthood, as an example, is regulated. I mean, they do have the Department of Health gets involved to the extent that many types of insurers will cover this as a basic benefit. The Division of Insurance gets involved, and in many ways, it's very similar to a lot of other healthcare services. And I didn't say with a single versus family conversation. Well, that's so self-disclosure. I've been a CFO for Kaiser Permanente. I've been a CFO of Planned Parenthood. Been a CFO at Trinity Healthcare, a Catholic organization. I've been around this from multiple sides. So, but what I find is how few people with an immense amount of wealth are trying their best to influence how others show up. So as an example, at Planned Parenthood, it's fairly well known that an individual helps to fund protesters at all of the abortion centers around the country. There is also a very wealthy individual who funds many of the services for those who cannot pay around the country. And it's just stunning to me when, as you've said, 85% of the population would probably be able to have a reason, in the right environment, would have a reasonable conversation, agree on values, and for the most part, be able to say, yeah, I want this type of healthcare services to be treated like most other healthcare services. Yet it's regulated, it should be part of insurance, and frankly, there should be some guardrails around it, and I think there are. But it's a very easy thing to get people riled up in almost any conversation about this, even though it really doesn't change anything. And it's just striking to me how much money is going into this. Get people revved up to be either, A+ on pro-life or A+ on pro-choice. It's just, I don't see a way out of it.
When it taints all the other politics, all the other issues get tainted by that. Yeah,
It takes all the oxygen out of the room when it comes up.
it does. Professor, response?
I mean, I agree, but I don't know what else to say other than I agree. Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, we only have 8 minutes max. So this is your time to jump in, or we're going to declare victory to make sure he doesn't miss his plane today. Who else wants to jump in? Dan, do you have any?
Can I ask a question?
Oh, where are you? Sorry,
Yeah,
who's
Jason.
asked? Oh, Jason, go ahead.
Professor Tootle, do you think they'll pass a law to try to codify Roe?
Well, that's the interesting question. So if you are pro-life, you should be careful what you wish for, because right now we have fewer abortions than we did when Roe was passed. And, so in that sense, and what would, and if you think about what would probably happen if Roe was overturned, if you're truly pro-life, you should be very careful about this, because if you're truly pro-life and Roe is overturned, it would not make abortion illegal. What it would do is it would return the decisions back to the states. And most of the states where most of the abortions take place would become more free to conduct more abortions. And as I forget who it was just said, you could just buy bus tickets for anybody who wants one to cross state lines. So I guess I would just caution everybody to try to understand what the implications are of what you're advocating before you make the blanket statement that somehow overturning Roe would result in I guess, again, getting back to another point, like people have a financial incentive to obscure or to obscure the consequences of overturning Roe. You got some people who are financially incentivized to say, if Roe is overturned, it will do X, Y, or Z. And you've got the other side saying the same thing, and they're both not being totally honest.
Seed planting, and then we'll have one quick question. We're going to do this again if the professor is willing. We'll wait till the case or another case comes in 3 months or 6 months. So if you're interested in this topic, you'll get another bite at the apple.
We should do it after Dobbs comes out. That's the big abortion case. Dobbs is coming up.
Exactly. So thanks for doing it, because the text is in the U.S. Supreme Court. Last call, team. Anthony, you want another one, or are you saying goodbye?
No, I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying I would like another one if it's okay, just real quick.
Go ahead, jump in.
I just think the critical nature of this issue is it's super personal. It's a personal decision that people make, and I think that's what kind of festers things. And as somebody who's been in this situation before, with this decision to be made, it's just something that when this issue comes up, it has a greater tendency to elicit an emotional response from many people who have had many very difficult decisions to make. And I think it's good to have a context for it that Professor Tootle offered, just looking at, hey, what is this about? Because then that allows me and other people to just put that to sleep and go, all right, how do we deal with this issue from a person-to-person issue and try to forget the fact that it's super, super personal, very, very important and personal issue. So.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's probably the wisest thing that was said today. I always try to remind people, especially people who claim to be Christians, not to break the first commandment. Do not put yourself in the place of God. Do not engage in judgment as though you are the arbiter of all wisdom for everyone else. And it seems like when we begin putting labels on one another regarding these issues, you've almost always broken the first commandment. Yeah. There's probably a reason why that was number one.
I wonder if we should end with that.
Well, if anybody else has a quick one, we got 3 minutes then.
Frank, sounds like you missed the show today because you're an hour late. Sorry about that. You'll have to rewind. And Frank, I think you're going to see Professor Tootle this weekend, so you can watch this and then ask your questions live. I think we're going to go ahead and end this, Professor, because I really want to see you in Colorado here this evening. I won't see you till later this evening. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Professor is going to be with me almost all day Saturday, and I'm kind of introducing him around town. So if you'd like to be introduced to him, very informal. I don't even think he's bringing a collared shirt, and I'm going to be wearing shorts. So coffee or beer, or you can have coffee or beer or something else. But just reach out to me privately and I'll tell you where we're at and you can come and join us. Professor, any concluding remarks off today's topic? Did you think I was going to talk about something else or ask you about other things, or is this kind of what you expected?
I mean, this isn't my first rodeo. Not my first discussion about abortion I've had in the last 23 years.
Cool. Well, thank you for your time. And again, we'll do it again. Team, thanks. We'll see you next Friday, I think. We haven't set the agenda, but I'm pretty sure we're going to do another one next Friday. We have lots of time to talk about it this weekend. Thanks for being here. See you on Tootle Talks. Join the Facebook group, as well as you can get all these other shows on our YouTube channel. Yeah, Tootle Talks. Thank you all. Goodbye. We're not doing an after discussion today because he's got to go catch a plane.